Okay, I guess we'll get going here. With maybe a light class today, which I was expecting from other professors saying that this has been a rough week for attendance.
It's not only Tuesday.
It's just,
Wait, hold up. Wait,
yeah, it's only Tuesday and people are already done for the week.
wait, what's going on?
Okay, to be fair though, I feel that last week was like a rough week for the week, but.
Yeah, well, coming back from spring, we just had spring break and then everyone was exhausted last week.
I'm just thinking about this.
All right, well, let's get going. Who's expecting to do a presentation today? And did you upload?
Yeah.
Okay.
Google Slides.
Yeah, I think Jose?
Yeah.
What's your last name?
Cervantes.
Yeah, I have yours. Bianca, were you going to go today or did you do it last week? I can't remember.
No, I already did both my presentations.
Perfect.
a while ago.
Okay, why do I think
You came out that last week too.
if Bianca was gonna go?
Yeah.
I just really want you to go again.
Oh,
No,
damn.
I'm fine. You're good. So no one else, just Jose? Okay, anybody on the Zoom expecting to do a presentation? Okay, good. Just the one. Okay, so let's finish up fiscal policy and then head into monetary policy. We'll just start lightly touching on monetary policy today. Okay, I forget where we were. Let's just do a quick refresher. Okay, so fiscal policy is when the government spends money or taxes money. If they spend more money, then there's more money in the economy and the multiplier kicks in and GDP goes up. If they tax less, then there's more money in everyone's pockets to spend. So people spend that and the multiplier is impacted. All right. Fiscal policy normally only impacts aggregate demand. So as you can see, when we have a contractionary fiscal policy where we're spending more and taxing, or contractionary would be we're spending less and taxing more. We can shift the AD to the left if we have an overheated economy, which I think is actually the next slide. That's the next slide. Shift it to the left, we are overheated. Or we do an expansionary policy, which is spending more or taxing less, and we can shift AD to the right. With the goal of getting to our long run or potential output. Okay, there are some criticisms of using fiscal policy. These criticisms generally aren't very accurate, as in what happens in reality. So one criticism is that if the government spends, then that crowds out spending their private sector, but that's not the case because as we learn, we can keep growing our economy. So there's no limit to how much we can spend. The other critique is that government borrowing can crowd out private borrowing, which is used for investment spending. And that one can be true, although it's not true very often. That's only true when we're already at the limits of available money being loanable funds availability. There is a finite amount of money to be loaned out at any given time. And then we have this budget deficits, reduced private spending. And again, this is not very often true because of just how people's behavior is. If things are going well now, then you're more likely to spend that money now than worry about the deficit and the tax increase or whatever down the road. The real problem with the fiscal policy is the lag it takes, the time it takes to identify as a recession, for example, decide to do something about the recession, get the political will to pass a spending bill, and then actually spend that money could take years. And in that time, we could naturally have gotten out of the recession and into expansionary period, and then we overheat the economy with this fiscal expansionary policy. Okay, then we talked a little bit about the multiplier effect. So when the government spends money, the standard multiplier that we've already learned, 1/1 minus MPC, works. But when the government just transfers money, like for Social Security, there's never that initial spend. So the multiplier has to take an effect into affect that lap of initial spend. So the formula is the transfers times MPC times 1/1 minus MPC. So essentially that formula just takes out that initial spend to get the multiplier effect. And we also looked at taxes. So tax policy, we have a progressive tax policy, and because it's progressive, it works as an automatic stabilizer, so that when the economy is doing well, everyone pays a little bit more in taxes, and by that paying more in taxes, then it slows things down. And then when things are not going well, people pay less in taxes. And because they're paying less, they have more money to spend, so that then heats up the economy. Okay. And I think the last thing we talked about was budget balance. So the government savings rate is the taxes they collect minus the expenditures they're making minus transfers. And whatever's left is either the surplus, or if there's negative, it's a deficit, we have to borrow. And that surplus or deficit level is affected by the cyclical nature of the business cycle. And we don't really care about deficits or surpluses in the short run because it's an effect, because it affects the business cycle. We want to know about the long run. So we can take out the numbers for the business cycle to find out what our actual budget deficit or surplus is. We do that through the cyclically adjusted business cycle, which I thought I had a slide on here. Yeah. Right. So if we take out the cyclically adjusted budget balance, we can see what the long run effect is. And if we're evening out of the long run, we're doing pretty good. All right, so that leads us into the new material for today. Deficits versus debt. So the deficit is what's happening this year. If the government is spending more than it takes in through taxes, then it's running out of deficit. It has to borrow money. Or if it's taking in more in taxes than it's spending, it's running out of surplus. And it have money left over, in the savings, national savings. But what happens over the long run is if there's too much deficit, if there's more deficits than surpluses, then we run up a debt. So the deficit is the running current balance if we're borrowing or creating a savings. And then over time, that adds up to a net in most countries, that adds up to a net debt. So we like debt, but so does everyone else. So here's our debt to GDP ratio. At this year, it was 2016, 77%. So we were running 77% debt to GDP. You can see all the major developed countries are also run some kind of debt to GDP, gross domestic product, right? With Greece, the worst here. Of course, we've done a little economics in action. This was a very unusual situation. Down to Norway. Norway doesn't actually run a debt. Why not? Well, they have a nationalized oil system where the country of Norway controls and profits from their oil reserves. So they're a very rich country, and they run a surplus from all that extra oil income. So 77% is what our hard debt is. not our implicit debt, which we'll get to in a second, but that's the actual money that we've borrowed and what we owe. So if our GDP this year is 20 trillion, I don't know what it actually is, but let's say it's 20 trillion, then our debt is around $14.5 trillion. Now look at Japan. Japan at this year was running 127. So Japan's the third richest economy in the world. We're the first richest. China's the second. France is one of the richest. Italy is one of the richest. Spain and Kingdom. There does seem to be a correlation between a high debt to GDP ratio and the richness and stability of an economy. Think about that. How come the richest and most stable economies on here also have extremely high debt to GDP? So maybe debt to GDP, maybe debt is not a bad thing. Well, the problems with debt is that public debt may crowd out investment spending. So we talked about this on last week, just reminded you about the crowding out. So there is a finite amount of loanable money. So the more debt that we hold of that, the more of the possible debt that is available, then that means there's less money available for private investors to go into debt, to build out factories and whatnot. That also means interest rates go up. So the more debt the US government holds, there's less money available. So then the price of borrowing money goes up, which is the interest rate. So that could be a negative effect of big government debt. Okay. Government default. This happens. Happened in Argentina, happens in other economies. It's pretty rare that a government borrows so much money and then they can't pay it. It makes people mad, people that the government owes money to. Sometimes governments that run up too much money and they can't pay it, they start printing. That leads to hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is what caused World War II. Because the World War I treaty that ended World War I made Germany pay back just an unfathomable amount of money to the Allies. And they couldn't, so they started printing money. And people in the 1920s in Germany would line their houses with Deutschmarks, like wallpaper. They'd burn it in the fire to keep warm because the paper money was so valueless because of hyperinflation. Okay, this is a couple of graphs of debt to GDP ratio. So this is the federal budget deficit is 1940 to 2016. Right, so World War II, big deficits up to 30%, but it's mostly even now. So it's the long run view. So we've mostly kept our debt at GDP, right? And GDP is our measure of country wealth. It's a measure of country income. So that kind of makes sense. So in the long run, as long as our debt is about what our income is, we're doing pretty good. Yes, we've had some dips. So here's the coming out of the OPEC caused recessions in the late 70s, stagflation. This is the Great Recession here. We had to spend lots of money to get out of these things. The tech boom of the late 90s led to a decrease in the deficit. We got to a surplus. Anybody have an idea who we owe money to? When we say the country owes 14 trillion in debt. You know, I guess it would be important to know if we know it's a bad thing. Because if we owe it to the mob, we don't want to be in a situation where we're not paying them. Well, that's kind of the implication when they say, oh, we owe it to China. That somehow that if they can come collecting like they're the mob, we can break our knees. They can't, because we spend all that money on the biggest military in the world by far, so no one's going to come break our knees. But more importantly, we don't owe that money to China. Right? We don't borrow money from other governments. We don't borrow money from some, Wells Fargo or some bank. The US government borrows money by selling T-bills, treasury bonds. And they sell them to anybody. So they do sell them to China and the countries, if those countries want to buy some, they sell them to individuals and private entities in other countries. But the vast majority are owned by US companies and US citizens. So is that a bad thing to owe ourselves money? Well, it's not, because we already learned it's really important for our economy to cycle money through all the time. And so when we looked at the earlier slide, the beginning of this chapter, that we're spending 11% of our yearly GDP on interest payments, something like almost $1 trillion. The vast majority of that money is coming back to us and circulating through our economy. So we spend $1 trillion and 600 billion of that gets put right back into our economy because it's paid out to US citizens and US corporations that own these treasury bills. So debt is not a bad thing for many reasons, including it stimulates the economy because of who holds that debt. Now, when and if you guys take a finance class, you'll learn that T-bills, their interest rate on T-bills, what they pay, it's called the risk-free rate. Because it is assumed that the US government will never default. So because they'll never default, that means if you buy a treasury bill, you're guaranteed to get that money back. It's risk-free. You're not taking any risk by buying it. That is until politicians in Congress every year say we're hit our debt ceiling, and we're not going to authorize more money until they get their pet projects done. And that's what they're arguing about. They're arguing about whether we as an economy should default on our debt when we hear the arguments about debt ceiling every year. Okay, so let's talk about the implicit liabilities. So that 77% debt to income or debt to GDP ratio, that doesn't include implicit liabilities. So what are implicit liabilities? These are mostly the transfers that we talked about. And the way the transfers are officially recognized, Social Security, for example, is they're not a debt, but they're a guaranteed public benefit. So the government has to pay it out. So that sounds like a debt. So when you factor in the implicit liabilities, it changes how our debt to GDP ratio. So we're going to be 77% without the implicit liabilities, but you add in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, now we're at 100% of GDP or 110% of GDP. So there's no consensus whether that's good or bad. There's no consensus whether you should include implicit liabilities in the debt, because it's not technically a debt, but because there's a law saying the government has to pay it out, it looks a lot like a debt. On the other hand, all these implicit liabilities are tax settled. So you have to pay your paycheck, every paycheck, you pay 15% to Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. So the biggest problem right now in these implicit liabilities is that baby boomers are living a lot longer than previous generations. And they're a big generation, bigger than our generation. Big, I don't think you guys and I are the same generation, but we're close, much bigger than our two generations. So they're living a lot longer, they're retiring, and these implicit liabilities are growing. So where it used to be in recent history, there were, for every 100 people working and paying into Social Security, they were supporting 36 people on Social Security. It's now something like for every 100 people, there's like 50 we're supporting. So it's a big burden. So by 2046, we're expecting an increase to 6.2 from 4.9% of GDP on Social Security. But Medicare is expected to go up a lot more. Because healthcare costs go up, because people are living longer, and as you get older, you have more healthcare costs. So unless we change the law, our government, meaning the taxpayers, are going to have to absorb these costs. Okay, so implicit liabilities are different, as I was mentioning, several reasons why, including the fact that laws that affect these can be structured in a way like the Affordable Care Act to have cost control measures. And we can use fiscal policy to greatly impact implicit liabilities. Okay. So that's fiscal policy. Any questions on fiscal policy? Questions on debt? So if there was one thing I wanted you to get out of this class, is that the multiplier, how the multiplier works. But if there's two things, it would be that national debt is not bad. In fact, it's good. When we're spending $1 trillion on interest every year because of national debt, that's almost all of that is going right into our economy every year. And then because we learned about the multiplier, we know 600 billion coming in interest payments, if it's spent back in the economy, is then multiplied by marginal propensity to consume. Okay, well, let's talk about, I know what happened. Let's talk about monetary policy. Now that we've done all this boring stuff in this class, let's get to why you guys really took this class. To learn about money. We finally have gotten to that. What is money? I'm asking. Anybody have an idea? I mean, we use it every day, but have you ever thought about it? What is money? Well, if you ask me, as an economist and lawyer, I would say money is any asset that can be easily used to purchase goods and services. Any asset. So it is not dollar bills. It's not gold. It could be anything that can be easily used to purchase goods and services. So, and here's an example in modern history, less than 100 years ago, during the Great Depression in the US, some towns turned to local homemade currencies. Clamshell script, they called it. In this example from Pismo Beach. What about when you go to an arcade, you get tokens? Kind of like the money. it's only good in that arcade, but it's something that meets all the definitions of money. So when we talk about money, we talk about currency. Currency is what we think of as dollar bills, and it's the amount of dollar bills and coins in circulation. Cash held by the public. Right, so currency is cash in circulation. What about checkable bank deposits? And for anybody under 60, a debit card, not checks. Is that money? Yeah. It's not cash. I get paid by direct deposit, goes right into my bank account, and then I use my card, my debit card, to spend it. I can go a month. I can go a whole lifetime at this point without ever having cash in my hand. It's all digital. Is that still money? It's not cash? Yeah, it's a checkable bank deposit. What's a checkable bank deposit? It's a checking account. So a checking account has a very specific legal meaning, and that is an account that is intended to have routine financial transactions, so money coming in and out. A savings account, which might seem like the same thing to you, because you go to you log in your bank website and you're checking your savings. By law, a savings account is not meant to have routine financial transactions. So it's not really money in that sense. You're not supposed to use that number in there, that digital money is not meant to be spent on a regular routine basis. Okay, so when we talk about the money supply, which we're going to talk about a lot, is we're talking about all the money that's the value of financial assets in the economy. So we're talking about our economy, the US economy. The government controls the money supply by printing money. And the amount of money they print versus the amount of money they destroy, because the government's destroying money all the time, what's left out there is the money supply. Okay. But to be money, whatever we're talking about, whether it's cash, US dollars, where it's clamshell script, whether it's gold, or it was seashells, Pacific Islands, or whatever. It has to have three things to be money. It has to be a medium of exchange. Right? It physically has to be something you can exchange. That's a store of value. It has to be a unit of account. Okay, so medium exchange. What does that mean? Something people accept as payment for goods and services. So something that's exchanged for that purpose, not for consumption. Right? Dollar bills have no other purpose other than as used as a medium exchange. You don't use dollar bills for anything else. What about gold? We use gold for money throughout most of modern or ancient history. Gold has another purpose besides as a use of money for consumption. Maybe it fits there, maybe not. He has a store of value. Money is money is a means of holding purchasing power over time. So an ice cream cone wouldn't be very good money. It melts. Lots of things wouldn't make very good money. It doesn't store value. Ice cream cone is an extreme example. What about Bitcoin? Does Bitcoin store value? Yeah. I could show you a chart or two that shows you how it doesn't store value at all. Because today it might be worth $40,000 for Bitcoin, and tomorrow it might be worth $5. There's no value being stored. Okay, and it has to be a unit of account. If I handed you a dollar bill right now, do you know what you can buy with that? Kind of. I mean, with inflation, maybe not exactly, but generally, you know, you can buy a candy bar, a soda. If I hand you a $10 bill, generally, you know, you could buy a meal at a fast food restaurant. What if I handed you a pig? Would you know what you can buy with a pig?
At least a soda.
Probably a soda, but it depends. If the person selling you the soda wants a pig, they might not. Right? A unit account means that it has some value that's useful and known. Right? We know a dollar bill or $10 bill or $100 bill. We know how much it's worth intuitively, because we know everyone wants it and everyone would take it in exchange for what they have. In a bartering economy, there's no unit of account, because what you have to offer, whether it be a pig or a cow or a homemade tool or knife or whatever, doesn't compare against what your neighbor has to offer. They have a cow and you have homemade jewelry, right? There's no comparison of what each one's valued, and they're only valued to somebody that wants that thing. I mean, can you imagine bartering for everything? It's a nightmare. First, you have to find, so you have a lack of information problem. So I have something, but I have no idea who wants that thing. And and the people that want what I have to offer have no idea who I am. And you know, unless we live in a tiny little town, can you imagine finding the person in Portland that wants the thing you want, and then just, you know, hoping that they have something in exchange that you want? Money makes it so much easier because we all want money and we all know how much money we should want. Okay, so the original money was commodity money, but money that was backed up by some commodity. So we went from a bartering economy where I have a cow, you have a pig, let's exchange, to I have gold, you maybe have gold, but we don't want to carry gold around, so let's you know, big pile of gold or whatever. So let's make some kind of representation of that, a dollar. Or let's make a coin, something that's easy to carry around. But that, whatever that was backed up by some commodity that had value. But over time, that came to the gold, generally is a gold backed form of money. So something that has very little intrinsic value, but backed up by the intrinsic value of commodity. So gold is the most obvious thing. So up until we went off the gold standard 80 years ago or so, the US printed dollars, but you could go turn those dollars in for an actual amount of gold in Fort Knox. Why would you want to do that? Well, because gold is heavy. You don't want to carry it around. You don't want to get robbed. There's all sorts of reasons why you don't want a bunch of gold around. You rather have this dollar. But what happens to all that gold? Well, it's not being used very well. If there's like 100 tons of gold sitting in Fort Knox, just sitting there, backing all this US currency in circulation, it's just sitting there being useless. So it's not a very effective use of resources of that commodity. It also puts a limit. If you only have 100 tons of gold, then you can only have them print the equivalent of that 100 tons redeemable in cash. So it puts a limit on the economy. Well, how do you get around that limit? Well, not everyone's going to come back and collect their gold at the same time. So you can print 200 million tons of cash, even though you only have 100 million tons of gold. Because some might come redeem their gold, but some might, and most will not. And then you can turn that 200 billion worth of cash into 300 billion. So wait a minute, that's kind of weird. Then you have all this cash out there that can't be redeemed for gold. What gives that value? And that's how you get the fiat money. Modern economies use fiat money. We use fiat money. Fiat money, fiat comes from the legal term of a decree by the ruler. The king has a fiat that we will now use cash without gold backing it. So that's what we do now. A dollar bill you have in your wallet does not represent any amount of gold in the US government. The only thing that gives it value is that everyone wants that dollar, and somebody will take it from you in exchange for a good or service. Some people are uncomfortable with that. I don't personally understand it, because if I had a handful of gold right now, I'm kind of taking that on faith and pride that somebody would want that from me. Because most people can't use gold for its intended purpose, or whatever gold's used for. Making shiny things, conducting electricity without corrosion. I don't really have a use for shiny things or conducting electricity without corrosion. So if I had gold in my hand, I always take it on trust that somebody would want that from me. The same if I have cash. Only with a modern economy like the US, I'm really not taking it on faith that somebody wants from me. What I'm taking on is that we've built a powerful economic system and a powerful military and powerful financial systems that are what actually back up the value of that money. So I would not take on faith the value of a North Korean dollar, but the value of a dollar printed off a modern economy that has a lot backing it up, I think it's a pretty good bet. Okay, one more concept, and then we'll call it for today. Now that we have a good idea what money is, when we talk about the money supply, we're talking about two different things. We're talking about M1 and M2. And when I was a student, I had to learn about M3, but M3 is no longer used. What M1 and M2 are ways to classify what money is in the aggregate. So M1 is the money that includes currency in circulation traveler's checks and checkable bank deposits. You ever heard of a traveler's check? Never even seen one in my whole life. I only know what one looks like because of watching movies like National Lampoon's European Vacation, came out in the early 80s with Chevy Chase. There's a couple scenes where they have traveler's checks, so I see that. But traveler's checks is a very liquid form of money that's no longer really used. But the other two forms are currency, circulations of cash, and the money in your bank accounts, in your checking accounts, not your savings accounts. So why do we care about this? Because this is the most liquid form of money there is. Liquid meaning the easiest to transfer, the easiest to trade for a good or service. Cash in hand or the money in your bank account where you can write a check or use a debit card. I can go to any person in the whole world just about with one of these two things and use it. Right now, no hesitation, no waiting around to transfer one thing into another thing. Cash and checkable deposits, very liquid, M1. M2 is M1 with what they call near monies. So financial asset that can't be used directly, but can be readily converted into cash or checkable bank deposits. So this is M1 plus money market funds, plus time deposits, plus savings deposits. Okay, we'll get those other two in a second, but savings deposits. So you log into your bank website and you have your accounts listed, you have your checking account. Hopefully it's not red, hopefully you have some money in there, and that's M1, you can use that immediately. You can immediately hand your debit card to somebody and buy something. But you also have your savings account, and hopefully you have some money in there too. But can you spend that immediately? Can you hand your debit card to somebody to buy lunch, and that money comes out of your savings account? No. There has to be an intermediate step. You have to transfer that money from your savings to your checking. That's why it's an M2. It's not immediate. It's pretty liquid. You can spend that money pretty quick, but it involves an extra step. Okay, so like with the Bitcoin, electronic banking, they can do it this day, but think about 50 years ago, if your money in your savings account was locked up from Monday at 5 or Friday at 5 till Monday at 9 a.m. when you can go back into the bank. So that's not very liquid. Okay, money market funds are mutual funds that invest into commodities, liquid commodities. So if I go to my broker, and I say, put this $100 into a mutual fund, he can put it into a mutual fund that buys things like stocks and other companies, and that's not very liquid. Or he can buy things he can buy mutual funds that buy gold, for example, or other easily tradable commodities, and that's pretty liquid because he can easily sell those. So that's what a money market is. And then time deposits. These are CDs, certificates of deposit. Certificate of deposit is a savings form that most banks have, traditional banks have, where you put in like 10 grand and that money's locked up for 6 months and you can't pull it out. And then you get 0.5% of interest at the end of 6 months. And by the means you can't pull it out is you can, but you have to pay a small penalty. So you pay 0.5% to pull that money out before it matures. So it's pretty liquid, but there's this extra step. Okay. Okay, that's it for today. On Thursday, we'll get into what banks do and how the banking system works. But until Thursday, think about your money, because no one ever thinks about it. They just want it, but they don't think about why you want it and how it works. Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll do our one presentation. Okay, we're all set. So there's only 2 in one slide. Okay. That was great.
Yeah.
Okay. So Just click the go between the slides here. That's fine. I found that the easiest way. Cool. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so my presentation is on the sections not so funny money and the history of the dollar. So not so funny money, this section talked about counterfeit money in the US. And it talks about Operation Sunset, which is a special operation done by Peruvian officials and in partner with the Secret Service in order to bust one of the biggest money counterfeit productions in Peru. Peru is one of the best producers of counterfeit money. They even have their own name for the dollar bill, which is the Peruvian note. And so that's the question, how bad is counterfeit money? Counterfeit money actually affects us directly, the taxpayers. I mean, just because later the dollar gets checked, and as soon as it's labeled as counterfeit, it loses all value. And so therefore it's gonna reduce the revenue for the government. And so that's gonna reduce how much they can pay for special operations, for the military, for roads, for everything that we as people pay for with our tax money. And then the history of the dollar, we talked about it in class today, but the dollar bill has no intrinsic value. It's not backed by anything. It doesn't have any actual value. And as we also talked in class, again, currency has not always just been the dollar or gold. It used to be tobacco, or up north, there used to be clamshells. And then dollar bills were created by banks, not by the government. And these notes were, again, they held value of however much gold was on the bill, or how much it represented on the bill. And then one of the big shifts to actual dollar bills and their money and their worth was the New Orleans Bank. This bank produced actual like paper bills. And a cool fact is one side was English, and the other was in French, because New Orleans used to be a French colony. And so from there, the government in 1872 started to issue greenbacks. And that was mostly just so that they could pay for the Civil War. And so from there, they had a couple different shifts from using actual money, like actual bills for currency. And then they stopped, and then they did again, until in 1971, the dollar became the most widely used currency in the world. And that's when it starts holding the value that it does, just because everyone wants to use the American dollar. And so that's the history of the dollar bill. Thank you.
Great. Great presentation, great pictures. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, don't be worried about if you have to do a presentation or after I talked about it, because half the people weren't listening when I talked about it. So then, you're just reinforcing the concept and helping everyone learn. Okay, well, you guys know what time it is. Quiz and then done. So let's get the quiz transferred up. Okay. Password is Fed.
So, is this not available until April 11th?
Oh,
Everything.
well, not every time. Sometimes.
This is a week 12-1.
It's week 12 one.
Is it?
I thought it was 11 2.
Wait,
one.
It's 12,
It's 12 one, though.
it's a 29.
Okay.
It's still-
Okay, I'll get there. All right. Okay, try it now.
Yeah.
Fed, FED.
Yay.